Hi folks, I'm a fashion designer and former sewing machine operator. I bought this gorgeous vintage Chanel Haute Couture blouse, and I'm going to use it to show you what makes haute couture, and couture sewing techniques in particular, so incredibly mind-blowing. I also have a Chanel ready-to-wear blouse so that you can see how regular luxury fashion is nowhere near the same level as haute couture. We'll be discussing three elements: construction/sewing techniques, materials, and very briefly, the whole production process and regulations surrounding haute couture, including fittings, the ateliers, etc. Without further ado, let me introduce you to this beauty. This is a vintage Chanel Haute Couture blouse from the 70s. I bought her from a vintage reseller in France for about $1,500. Buying Chanel Haute Couture new would definitely cost a lot more than this. Definitely at least 5 figures for something like this. Obviously, the outside is beautiful, but the real magic, in my opinion, is the inside, where you can see the couture sewing techniques. Couture sewing techniques are, by and large, done by hand. For the purposes of this video, there are essentially 4 types of sewing techniques that we're going to talk about: hemming, seaming, seam finishes, and closures. Starting with hemming, you can see here on this haute couture blouse that the hem was done by hand. This looks like an uneven slip stitch, which is when your sewing needle catches only a few threads, like 1 or 2, of the fabric where you don't want the stitch to be visible. I've linked a video below on how to do an uneven slip stitch if you're interested in learning more, as well as an article on a variety of blind hem techniques. Now, if we look at the Chanel ready-to-wear blouse, this is also a vintage blouse, but it's from the early 2000s if I'm not mistaken. And you can see here the hem is clearly done by machine. First of all, they had a machine do a very narrow overlock stitch to keep the edge from unraveling, and then they folded it over and top stitched the hem down. Now, it does look really good. It can certainly be difficult to sew a very narrow hem like that, and as someone who has worked in a sewing factory, you're not allowed to bring any gadgets like special tape that would make sewing a very narrow baby hem like that easier. So hats off to the production facility employees who made it. Not an easy thing to do. However, the fact remains that a machine sewn hem like that is going to take a lot less time than a hand-sewn one. Next, you've got what are called seam finishes, which is anything you do to prevent the raw edges from unraveling. On this blouse, the seams primarily appear to be finished via hand overcasting, which I honestly don't think is that attractive, but that's not the point. It's a type of hand stitch where you make little diagonal stitches down the edges of the fabric. As you can see, this is somewhat of a slow process, compared to, for example, many regular industrially sewn garments, including this Chanel ready-to-wear blouse, where often the seam allowances are serged, otherwise known as overlocked. Serging is really fast, guys. It takes like no time at all. So it's an inexpensive way to finish a seam. And frankly, I find it kind of egregious that this ready-to-wear blouse has serging in it, especially such ugly thread-ridden serging. Like, what is going on here? This blouse probably cost like $1,000 new, maybe even more than that. Maybe slightly less because it was 2007, I'm not exactly sure. Either way, it was expensive, and they were like, yeah, just up the armhole, make it as ugly as possible, no problem. I will say the Chanel ready-to-wear blouse does have other seam allowances that actually look nice. For instance, there's a French seam at center back and a bias-bound seam at the yoke. I've linked videos on what both of those are if you're curious. Those are both considered higher-end seam finishes than, say, serging because they take more time to do, and they look much nicer. That said, it's still not couture sewing because it's done by machine. You could do a French seam or a bias-bound seam by hand in a couture fashion, and I'm demonstrating a hand-sewn French seam here on screen. I'll put some links below on how to do a French seam or a bias-bound seam by hand. As you can see, it takes time. Are you sensing a theme here? Couture pieces are expensive and prestigious, in large part because the sewing techniques all take time. Last sewing technique I'm going to show you before we move on to talking about materials is closures. A very common type of closures on haute couture pieces is buttons. You've got these gorgeous golden shank buttons here, and hand-sewn buttonholes. You can tell they're sewn by hand because the stitches are not completely uniform and the shape is not perfectly symmetrical on both sides. Whereas on the ready-to-wear blouse, the stitches are perfectly evenly spaced, perfectly uniform in length, and perfectly symmetrical. But overall, I think it actually looks less nice, partly because of the interfacing and fabric fluff in the center, and partly because there's just something so artistic and pretty about couture buttonholes. Sewing buttonholes by hand is a painstaking process that takes a long time to master. I tried a few months ago and it took forever and looked awful. So hats off to the skilled artisans in the ateliers who are really doing the most. Snaps are another closure you'll see in haute couture. What makes these ones extraordinary on the haute couture blouse is that they are painstakingly covered with the outer fabric, which is a very fine, delicate silk crepe or chiffon perhaps. So it was probably a pain in the ass to do that. Also, again, they're sewn by hand very nicely to the blouse. Now you'll recall I mentioned 4 types of sewing techniques and I've only talked about 3. The last one is seaming, which is where you actually physically sew the 2 pieces of fabric together, like a side seam, armhole seam, etc. On this haute couture blouse, the seaming actually appears to have all been done by machine, and I'm going to talk about why I think that's significant later. Let's move on to talking about materials. The textiles used in haute couture really are incredible and are very difficult, impossible even, to replicate on an industrial scale. They are typically incredibly time-consuming to produce or are special or rare in some way. Now, the fabric on this Chanel Haute Couture blouse has stumped me a little bit because I don't know very much about weaving, so I'm not sure exactly how it was made. As you can see, there are 2 different, for lack of a better word, types of fabric. This shiny part, which is a satin weave, and this translucent / dusty looking part, which looks to be a crepe, or maybe more like a chiffon actually, because of how translucent and light it is. There are no seams between these 2 fabrics. They seamlessly transition from one to the other. This is very unique and uncommon. I don't know exactly how they would have done this because it is 2 different weaves. A satin weave has yarns that kind of float over top instead of going over under each time, which is what gives it that glossy appearance. Whereas chiffon is generally a plain weave, if I'm not mistaken, which, unlike satin, is over under over under. The yarns also seem like they would be different. Chiffon or other similar fabrics like crepe typically have highly twisted yarns that give it that kind of pebbly texture. I inquired on 2 different internet forums, one that is for fashion industry professionals and one that is a weaving Facebook group, and there were a lot of opinions on how this might have been done, possibly a jacquard machine. The consensus is that it was machine woven, and also that the print was printed or painted on somehow, as opposed to being woven in. You can see that the print is a little bit diffuse at the edges, whereas that would not be the case if it were woven in. The fiber content is silk, by the way, so a silk satin and a silk chiffon. Having 2 different types of fabric in one is pretty rare, and I don't think that would be common to see in luxury ready-to-wear. Like you see in the Chanel ready-to-wear blouse, the fabric is a silk crepe or other similar pebbly textured fabric. It's nice, but that really is all there is to say about it. Whereas with haute couture, it's like, wait, how did they do that? Okay, so we've talked about sewing techniques, we've talked about materials. Are those the only things that make haute couture haute couture? No, there is a whole distinct production process and set of regulations surrounding the use of this term. The first thing to understand is the distinction between an haute couture maison, maison means house in French, and couture sewing techniques. High-end designers and luxury brands will sometimes use couture sewing techniques, but that doesn't mean that they're allowed to call what they're doing haute couture. And similarly, haute couture houses don't necessarily exclusively use couture sewing techniques. For example, we can see here in the Chanel Haute Couture blouse that the seaming, so the sewing that actually attaches the pieces of the garment together, appears to have been done by machine. The stitches are extremely regular in terms of the length and tension, and they are small, tight stitches that only have very small gaps in between, which can be hard to replicate by hand. You can also see on the armpit pads here that they were actually serged around the edges, which is obviously not something that can be done by hand. Back to what haute couture actually means. Haute couture is a legally defined designation in France, and I literally read this long-ass document, well, half of it, from the French Ministry of Culture to explain to you exactly what it means. In a rather large nutshell, haute couture is based on the creation of unique pieces that are entirely made to measure. Houses that can call themselves haute couture houses must be based in France. They must have at least 1 production atelier and at least 1 presentation salon, with at least 20 salaried employees that work on the production of their collections. This document talks a lot about different sewing techniques and the roles of different employees within the atelier. They work essentially by hand, with the exception of certain assemblages that can be completed by machine. This is interesting, I'm going to come back to that right at the very end. A key part of haute couture is that it is all made to measure. In this document, it specifies that there need to be at least 1 or 2 fittings on the model or client for each piece. In terms of production process, haute couture pieces are made 1 at a time. Often, only 1 of each style is made. Not this one though, I did see another one for sale online in Spain this time. You have des toiles, or toiles if I'm pronouncing it in an English manner, which are unfinished mock-ups, usually made out of a fabric like muslin to test the style and the fit. You don't have tech packs the way you would in an industrial setting. From what I understand, often creative directors will give sketches, which are typically artistic in nature and have idealized proportions, and don't necessarily reflect construction details thoroughly. And then the atelier staff interpret the sketches, figure out out a lot of the construction details, and then make mock-ups for the creative director to see if it fits their vision. This is completely foreign to me as a designer working in the industry. I'm a uniform designer. Haute couture is very different from ready-to-wear or any other industrially made clothing, which is most of the industry, where you don't want anybody to interpret anything because that's probably going to lead to a waste of time and money. You want very clear technical sketches and tech packs where the construction details are all very accurately called out so that the people making your samples or your finished garment have a very good idea of what to do right from the jump. Back to the long French document, I thought this was interesting. Permission to use the designation of haute couture is granted by a committee made of people from existing haute couture houses and other qualified persons who serve 3-year renewable terms on the committee, and the final decision to grant the haute couture designation is subject to agreement by the French Ministry of Industry. That's France for you. So that was a lot of information. But the long and short of it is that haute couture houses are based in France, have 20+ employees, and make made-to-measure pieces for clients that require fittings. And they work essentially by hand, which brings us to the notion of couture sewing techniques. Haute couture houses make regular use of couture sewing techniques, and there's quite a few of them listed in this French document. However, the document also says, as I said before, they work essentially by hand with the exception of certain assemblages that can be completed by machine. This is something I find intriguing. It doesn't specify which assemblages or whether there's a threshold at which point there is too much machine assembly for it to be considered haute couture. I have a sneaking suspicion that over time haute couture has perhaps become more industrialized and that the use of machines has increased, although that is not actually based on any data, it's just a hunch. I'd love to be able to compare some vintage haute couture to present day haute couture pieces to see if that appears to be a trend, but that would require an amount of money that I do not have or access to an archive that I also do not have. Maybe someday. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for accompanying me on this nerdy deep dive, and I'll see you in the next video.